In 1978, America was facing a fuel crisis unlike anything before. Gas lines snaked through city blocks, tempers flared at fuel stations, and drivers were desperate for any way to stretch a gallon further. General Motors, seeing both a challenge and an opportunity, introduced what they believed would revolutionize fuel efficiency, the Oldsmobile 350 diesel V8. It was marketed as a breakthrough engine, promising around 30% better fuel economy than its gasoline counterparts. And GM wasted no time installing it in nearly everything, from Cadillacs to Chevrolets. But what started as a bold innovation quickly unraveled into one of the most notorious engineering disasters in American automotive history. The engine didn't just fail, it self-destructed, left countless owners stranded, triggered nationwide lawsuits, and shattered America's trust in diesel-powered passenger cars for decades. To understand how this all went wrong, we have to look back to the mid-1970s. The 1973 Arab oil embargo had turned the American automotive landscape upside down. Gas prices skyrocketed almost overnight, and the long lines at fuel stations became a daily reminder of the crisis. The era of big, powerful muscle cars came to an abrupt end. Those massive V8 engines that once symbolized freedom and power were suddenly seen as fuel-hungry relics. Around the same time, new government fuel regulations known as Corporate Average Fuel Economy or CAFE standards began pushing automakers to dramatically improve efficiency. By the mid-1980s, manufacturers would need to hit fleet averages of roughly 27.5 miles per gallon, a seemingly impossible target for companies like GM, which had built its empire on large, heavy cars powered by thirsty V8s. Across the Atlantic, European automakers had already found a solution: diesel power. Brands like Mercedes-Benz had been refining diesel passenger cars since the 1930s, and by the 1970s, their engines had earned a reputation for durability, reliability, and impressive fuel economy. Companies like Peugeot and Volkswagen were also selling diesel cars that Americans could only dream of in terms of efficiency. GM saw this success and wanted in. Diesel fuel was not only cheaper, but also more energy-dense than gasoline, allowing for greater mileage. And best of all, diesel technology seemed like the shortcut GM needed to meet those demanding fuel economy regulations without completely re-engineering its entire vehicle lineup. On paper, the idea was perfect. Americans still loved their big, comfortable cars, but could no longer afford to keep feeding their fuel-thirsty engines. A diesel V8 that could deliver 25 to 30 miles per gallon in a full-size sedan seemed like the best of both worlds: luxury, power, and economy. But what looked brilliant in theory became disastrous in execution. Instead of building a diesel engine from scratch like Mercedes-Benz had done, GM made a fateful choice. They would take their existing Oldsmobile 350 cubic inch gasoline V8 and simply convert it to run on diesel. That decision would haunt them for decades. It wasn't just cutting corners, it was an engineering shortcut that ignored the fundamental differences between gasoline and diesel engines. Unlike gasoline engines, which rely on spark plugs to ignite a fuel-air mixture and operate with relatively low compression ratios of around 8:1 to 10:1, diesel engines depend entirely on compression to ignite the fuel. They squeeze air to extremely high pressures, reaching ratios of 17:1 to 22:1, generating far greater internal stresses. This meant every part of a diesel engine, from the block and head to the crankshaft and bolts, needed to be significantly stronger. Diesel engines face roughly 50% higher cylinder pressures than gasoline counterparts, a difference that can literally tear apart components that weren't built to handle that kind of strain. The Oldsmobile 350 gasoline block, while solid and dependable for its original purpose, was never designed to endure such brutal forces. GM did make some modifications. They raised the compression ratio, strengthened the block with a bit more nickel, redesigned the pistons, adjusted the camshaft, and integrated a new fuel injection system through a partnership with Stanadyne. But the most critical flaws remained untouched. The head bolt pattern and gasket design were unchanged. The crankshaft was still made from brittle cast iron instead of forged steel, and the overall block structure lacked the rigidity that a diesel engine demanded. Some engineers within GM reportedly raised red flags, warning management that the engine's durability was questionable at best. But corporate pressure was intense. Deadlines were tight, budgets were stretched thin, and the company was already spending billions retooling its entire lineup for better fuel economy. The diesel project had to move fast, even if it meant skipping proper testing. So, in 1978, GM proudly launched the Oldsmobile 350 diesel. It produced 120 horsepower and 220 pound-feet of torque. Modest, but acceptable for the time. And most importantly, it delivered on its promise of fuel efficiency. Owners reported getting between 25 and 30 miles per gallon, sometimes even more. Encouraged by the results, GM began installing the engine across nearly all of its divisions: Oldsmobile, Buick, Pontiac, Chevrolet, and even Cadillac. By 1980, Cadillac's Seville luxury sedan came standard with the 350 diesel. At first, sales were strong. Thousands of Americans, drawn by the promise of high mileage and cheaper fuel, jumped on the diesel trend. But before long, the nightmare began. Engines were failing not in small numbers, but in waves. What started as isolated complaints soon grew into a nationwide scandal. The primary failure? Head gaskets. The immense diesel pressures simply tore through the gasoline-based head bolt design. Many engines blew their head gaskets before even reaching 30,000 miles. And when a diesel engine suffers a head gasket failure, the consequences are catastrophic. Coolant seeps into the combustion chambers, leading to overheating, hydrolocking, and total engine destruction.
The problems with GM's 350 diesel only grew worse over time, and the list of failures was staggering. In many cases, the engines would hydrolock, a condition where coolant leaked into the cylinders. When the piston tried to compress that liquid, something that simply can't be done, the result was catastrophic. Connecting rods bent or snapped, destroying the engine from the inside. But that was just the beginning. The cylinder heads themselves were prone to cracking, the result of immense compression pressure, high heat, and weak head bolt clamping force. Cracks often appeared between the valves or near the pre-combustion chambers, and once that happened, the engine was finished. Replacing or repairing the head didn't solve the core issue. The design was simply too fragile for diesel duty. The crankshaft failures were just as devastating. GM's decision to use a cast nodular iron crankshaft instead of a forged steel one proved fatal. Diesel engines produce immense stress on the crankshaft because of the violent combustion process and high compression ratios. These cast crankshafts couldn't cope with the strain. They developed hairline cracks that often grew until the crankshaft finally broke, sometimes after tens of thousands of miles, sometimes far sooner. The weak engine block didn't help either. The main bearing caps would shift under load, causing the bearings to fail and oil pressure to drop, which led to more engine seizures and failures. Then came another major problem: the fuel injection system. GM used a Stanadine mechanical fuel pump, which was a decent design on its own, but the system depended heavily on the lubricating qualities of diesel fuel. Even small amounts of water contamination, something the system was oddly prone to, could destroy it. A seized pump often meant complete failure of the entire fuel system, and repairs were expensive. Adding to the misery, most owners didn't know that diesel engines required special care. They needed specific, high-detergent oil, frequent fuel filter changes, and clean, water-free diesel. But because these cars were marketed to average drivers, not diesel mechanics, maintenance was often neglected or done incorrectly. Even some dealerships treated the engines like gasoline units, unknowingly speeding up their destruction. At first, GM tried to contain the situation quietly. They released technical service bulletins, made minor adjustments, and extended certain warranties. But the problems kept multiplying. By the early 1980s, the Oldsmobile 350 diesel had become infamous, a byword for unreliability. Owners were outraged. Many had purchased their cars for the promise of long-term savings in fuel efficiency, only to face repair bills larger than the car's value. The backlash turned into a legal storm. Class action lawsuits began pouring in from across the country, accusing GM of knowingly selling defective engines. Internal memos that surfaced later suggested that some within GM were indeed aware of the engine's weaknesses before launch, but corporate leadership pushed forward anyway. Eventually, GM settled multiple lawsuits, spending millions to repair its image, though the damage to its reputation was irreversible. GM continued producing versions of the diesel through the early 1980s, making small improvements along the way. They introduced better head gaskets, revised torque specifications, and strengthened certain internal parts. These upgrades helped somewhat, but the stigma was too powerful to overcome. By the time production ended in 1985, the engine's reputation was completely destroyed. And with it, so was America's trust in diesel passenger cars. For decades afterward, diesel engines carried a curse in the US market. Even as European automakers like Mercedes-Benz, Volkswagen, BMW, and Peugeot rolled out clean, efficient, and long-lasting diesels, American buyers wanted nothing to do with them. The shadow of the Oldsmobile diesel failure loomed large. It was tragic because by the late 1990s and 2000s, diesel technology had improved tremendously. Electronic injection, turbocharging, and precise emissions control had made modern diesels powerful, smooth, and efficient. Yet in the US, the memory of GM's failed experiment continued to poison public perception. What makes the story especially frustrating is that GM had been right about one thing: diesel technology truly was the future of fuel efficiency. They correctly identified the need for more economical powertrains at a time when gas prices were crippling the market. Europe proved the concept worked. By the early 2000s, diesel cars accounted for over half of new vehicle sales in many European countries. They were quiet, clean, and incredibly efficient. Had GM invested properly in a purpose-built diesel engine or partnered with an established diesel manufacturer, the outcome could have been entirely different. They could have led the diesel revolution in America. Instead, they became a cautionary tale of how cost-cutting and corporate pressure can destroy innovation. Ironically, GM did eventually learn from its mistakes. In 1982, they introduced a 6.2-liter diesel V8 designed from scratch as a true diesel engine. This one was far more reliable and found a loyal following in GM trucks throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Many of these engines are still running today, a testament to what GM could have achieved if it had done things right the first time. But then the damage had already been done. Americans had made up their minds. Diesel engines were for trucks and heavy equipment, not family sedans. The Oldsmobile 350 diesel remains one of the most infamous examples of engineering gone wrong in automotive history. It wasn't just an engine failure, it was a failure of corporate vision and engineering integrity. It serves as a painful reminder that no matter how good an idea looks on paper, ignoring the fundamentals will always come back to haunt you. GM had the right concept, but the wrong foundation. And that single mistake didn't just doom an engine, it doomed an entire generation of American diesel cars.